Hello and welcome back to the Indian Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Raj Balkaran. And today we're going to change it up a bit. And rather than me yammer on about some stories, some wisdom, and this and that, we're going to get to meet another fascinating figure in the field. And we will feature an interview with Dr. Christopher Jain Miller, who is Vice President of Academic Affairs and Professor of Jain and Yoga Studies at Arihanta Institute, who is an avid online educator as well as a scholar practitioner. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Raj. I personally would love to just sit here for an hour and listen to you tell stories, but we can talk about whatever you want today.
Great. So I can't do all the work all the time, Chris. The other podcasts I'll send to you. You can. There's no paywall. You can have them for free. No worries. Um, so why don't you tell us a little bit about, I think maybe the first question in people's mind, just because of the introduction, is the Arihant Institute. What is the Arihant Institute?
Yeah, so the Arihanta Institute is an online educational platform. We're a nonprofit based in California, and we teach all things about the Jain tradition and, as we say, allied fields of inquiry. And that means a lot of things, but we're essentially focused in Jain studies and what we call engaged Jain studies. And what we really want to show from our mission statement standpoint is the way that Jain principles and practices can be engaged with the world to make the world a better place. So that's my elevator pitch on what we are. There's much more to it, of course, but that's Arihanta Institute kind of in a nutshell. And so we offer courses, online courses, self-study certificate courses. You can do live with us or you can do self-study. And we also have an online master's degree program that we teach in collaboration with Claremont School of Theology in Los Angeles, California. So people can study with us in a number of ways and also engage with us in a number of ways. We have talk and speaker series, online conferences, all these things people can stay up on by subscribing to our newsletter, but we have a fairly regular schedule of activity that follows along in all of those different areas.
Fascinating. Well, certainly we'll have a link to the institution and upcoming events as part of the podcast notes. Now, this city of Los Angeles, California, I'm going there, I'm pretty sure for the first time. Sometimes we have conferences and events in cities and we forget, oh, yes, I've been to Thailand. I've been to Bangkok for the World Sanskrit Conference in 2015, but I don't remember any of Thailand because I just went for the conference and I flew out. So I don't think I've been to LA before, but I have a retreat coming up in LA and it's interesting because you interview a zillion people, but you don't really put them together in your brain. And there's like, a half a dozen scholars I've interviewed who are at various institutions in LA, some of whom I might have coffee with while we're there. But yes, Claremont, of course, is in LA as well. And if I'm not mistaken, it's your home city, isn't it?
Los Angeles is my home city. That's right. That's where I grew up and lived almost 40 years of my life before moving here to where I am now in Zurich.
Okay.
So have
Cool.
a good time, Raj. And if you need any tips, you can ask.
Okay. I will definitely reach out. I'll reach out on what I can do for fun aside from speak to scholars and prepare for the retreat. Um, Actually, you know what? We'll put the retreat link in the podcast notes as well in case there are any takers. Just reach out to me though before you sign up to make sure there's still room. So so um, a smart spiritual gentleman growing up in Los Angeles who's now heavily involved in Jainism and the study of Jainism and the teaching of Jainism and the advancing of Jain ideals for the amelioration of our world. Tell us a bit about that journey.
Yeah, it's funny. You just reminded me as you were saying that when I first spoke to my PhD advisor after I finished my PhD, she said to me, well, you did it. And this is Professor Smriti Srinivas at the University of California, Davis, who's an anthropologist. You did it. You did your PhD. And then it was right actually after I published the book based on my PhD. And she said, when I first met you 10 years ago, you walked up and you were just this surfer guy from Los Angeles who wanted to learn more about yoga. And that's really what I was. I mean, I really didn't know anything about academia beyond, having gotten a degree in accounting before that. And I really didn't know much about yoga yet. I thought I did. And so my academic journey began, I guess you could say, through yoga, through the practice of yoga, and through, all the different things people do in yoga. They do asana, obviously postural practice, things like this. But we were also engaged in a 2-year yoga teacher training when I first started back in 2012, when my yoga teacher training started. And we were told to become vegetarian. We were told to chant this mantra and that mantra. We were doing pranayama. We were doing all kinds of meditations and things like this. And I found it to be an extremely transformative experience. And even before that, as a surfer in Southern California, I felt always deeply connected to the natural world around me and its rhythms, right? Amidst all the other things I was doing, I always found that as this opportunity to kind of get in touch with nature, so to speak, and felt kind of profoundly, I guess you could say, connected to the Southern California landscape through all those experiences. I had been exploring religious traditions as I was working as a CPA in my 20s, a certified public accountant in Southern California. I met Jains during my work. My first supervisor was a Jain in public accounting. I started taking courses at Cal State Long Beach just for fun, just to take some courses and enjoy myself and follow my spiritual interests through the field of what we are both in various ways, religious studies. So I was studying in religious studies and then eventually left to manage a yoga studio that many people have probably heard of. Yoga Glow is what it used to be called. Now it's just called glow.com. I was the production and studio manager there. And I met yoga teachers from all over the world coming in and telling me this, that, and the other thing is true about yoga. And I didn't know who to believe. I didn't know what was true and what was not. And I just practiced, and I loved practicing with all of them. I mean, it was just kind of an immersion into the world of yoga that was really before my scholarly pursuits. And so I was kind of this surfing yogi guy in Southern California who had a profound interest in learning more about yoga as I got to know more about it. And I got more immersed in the practice. And then I eventually applied to go do a PhD. And years later, my PhD advisor said, when I first met you, you were just a surfing guy from Southern California. And I guess I still kind of just am a surfing guy from Southern California, but I live in Zurich now. So that's part of my story.
Holy cow, Christopher Miller. He's an accountant. He's a surfer. He's a scholar. He's a practitioner. He's an administrator. Not bad, not bad. He's the package apparently. That's a really fascinating story, and it certainly is something to whenever you land in a spot that has a natural beauty, or near bodies of water in your nature. Certainly, there's a palpable energy, if you will. I remember the first time I went to Hawaii about a year and a half ago to just do some workshops and teachings for some students. Ironically, none of the students, I have a great many students, none of whom are in my home city of Toronto. They're everywhere but Toronto, which means that they coax me into getting on planes and going places so they can have in-person teachings. And so I was very much looking forward to meeting the students, and the programming that we had, I think, was on the goddess. It was something about Shakti oriented. But what I didn't anticipate about the trip was the utterly transformative and palpably pleasant energy field of Hawaii. It's just a different world. It's like as soon as you land, I mean, depending on how force sensitive you are, if you will, but as soon as you land, it's really very pleasant out there. And I can understand why certain Americans land there and are like, why would I live in any other state? And they move there. So I look forward to enjoying some of Southern California. A couple of my core students are there, and they're looking forward to showing me stuff out there. Would you say that your interests at the outset, were they spiritual? Were they intellectual? Were they cultural? How might you describe them?
Yeah, I come into this in the totally kind of spiritual practitioner direction. I'm one of those people who was in yoga for a while and just had a lot of spiritual interests without real intellectual interest beyond. I was working in public accounting, so I was staying on top of the Internal Revenue Code at the time, but I had no strong intellectual interest. I came into religious studies wanting to know, how can I find peace of mind? And for some reason, I thought that religious traditions might be able to offer that, broadly speaking. And that's when I found the Dharma traditions, which were a kind of response to not having peace of mind, to having suffering, and to all the things that we experience in the world. And that's what really kind of turned me on to focusing first on Dharma traditions and yoga, and then eventually Jain studies. It acknowledged that the world is full of suffering, and then it gave all different kinds of interesting solutions and practices to cope with and come to terms with that in various ways. And so I came strictly as a practitioner, and as I started to learn about these traditions and their practices, I wanted to be engaged in the practices more so than intellectual study at first, at least. You spoke about Hawaii. I lived a couple of years in Hawaii as well. And I agree with you. There's what other state would people want to live in when you're living in the United States, right? Other than California, maybe in LA. And so I lived in Hawaii for a couple of years, both before and during my PhD. I split up the time and I was doing field research there. Actually, one of my communities, practicing yoga communities, was on the Big Island of Hawaii. And so I never really lost that. I mean, I came in with that angle. A lot of people come into religious studies or the study of religion with a kind of purely academic interest, and that's fine, and we need that, and we need those critical approaches. But as I developed my own kind of critical eye for what I was seeing in the field and what I was experiencing in yoga communities around the world, I never really lost that passion and kind of drive to continue to practice and to continue to be the best possible version of whatever tradition I was practicing wanted me to be. It was really inspiring for me, all the various yoga traditions and religious traditions. And so that part has never gone away. And I would say in some ways, the critical approach to the study of religion, the intellectual approach, has become a core part of who I am now as well. But I'm still at my core also simultaneously a practitioner. I'm not going to stop surfing. I'm not going to stop meditating and doing pranayama and all these things. These are all kind of core parts of me, you can say, that you can't always reconcile, but they live within us. So
there are a number of types of theorization that come from the ancient Indic world, that whether they have ontological reality or metaphysical veracity or not, they're utterly compelling. Let's leave aside karmic theory, which itself is a profound and compelling rabbit hole. But when we think of the conception of humanhood, the notion of koshas, we all know that we're multiple selves, and we all know that, but to theorize that, okay, we have an intellectual self that needs to be fed, right? We have a mental emotional self that needs to be fed. We have a physical self that needs to be fed. We have an energetic self that needs to be fed. And if you're lucky, you'll find the Anandamaya kosha, the bliss body, which needs to be fed. I tease with my students. I said, listen, if you're looking for knowledge expansion, fine, go and go sit at the feet of whomever is pontificating in somewhat of an accurate manner. But if you're looking for embodied wisdom, and that person is bereft of joy, run for the hills, close the browser and run for the hills. But the idea that, yes, scholarship is, we need to feed our intellectual selves. And this is the domain of scholarship. And this is really important. There are a great many of us who are very good at this piece, but they live there. They wake up there and they go to bed there. And that's wonderful. There's also a deeper aspect of self. And that aspect of self is so neglected that en masse, we have a phenomenon called a midlife crisis in the Western world. Because, wait a minute, the stuff they told me I should have doesn't make me happy, et cetera, et cetera. And so the chickens have to come home to roost at some point. So irrespective of whether you are an intellectual or a creative or an innate spiritualist, we all need to feed our spiritual selves. We all need to broach life's big questions. We all need to make meaning. And it takes nothing like this is why births and deaths and weddings are so profound, because the glitches in the matrix shine forth and you're like, oh, there's something going on to this reality that's more than meets the eye. And I think that the individuals who are there and seeking that, I think in one sense they're ahead of the game, provided that they don't fall prey to disembodied belief systems or sort of spiritual bypassing. And I find it so interesting. It took me 2 years at the Indian Wisdom School to realize, wow, all of my students are categorically super smart and super spiritual. Either of those is relatively rare, but both of those, one sort of tempers the other, the practical and the spiritual, one sort of the inner life and the outer life. And I think it's scholarship is an excellent tool and even complement to the spiritual pursuit. But that's provided that you have and you're interested in developing your spiritual self to begin with. But if you look at scholarship as a means in and of itself, with respect to religious studies, then that tends to be reductionistic, I find. So I think I'm always fascinated with people who are able to dovetail the two, because there are many individuals who would think of them as oil and water or mutually exclusive. I mean, they're Christian theologians who are fine, toggling between the two because they don't have as much of the cultural baggage or prejudices or et cetera, et cetera. But I wonder for you, Chris, is it at all, is it a tension? How do you integrate, or is there even need to integrate spiritual and intellectual selves?
Yeah, no, I think I share the passion with you, Raj, to kind of live in both worlds and see them as complementary to one another. Definitely, I would say. And we're talking about different ways of knowing. I mean, the religious studies way of knowing, as you say, can be very reductionistic and over intellectualized. And then the spiritual side that we think of can often overlook all the important points that the religious studies people are making, the critiques and the criticisms about the material world that are very true and real. But I think if we don't have both together, we can't. I think it makes us a more whole person, let's say. And I really think that there's still there are a lot of things in these spiritual systems. The Jain tradition is the one that I'm most frequently teaching now, that are sort of perennial, universal wisdom that I think you will find in other Dharma traditions as well, yoga traditions, Hindu traditions, Buddhist traditions, so forth. And there are also things that are not scientifically kind of verifiable anymore, right? And that's where I think really like religious studies can help us pick up and be a little bit more accurate and critical about the way that we view the world and what we know about the world. But there are still things that are in these Dharma traditions that are themselves so grounded in the accumulation of knowledge that when combined together with these very powerful methods of religious studies, I think lead to a more complete vision of the world. Not a complete vision of the world, but a more complete vision of the world and human experience, as you would say. And a lot of these traditions focus on that experience. A lot of people say that that's a modern thing to focus on experience, but these traditions have been focused on individual experience for God knows how long, right? Or goddess knows how long. It's been like that for a long time. And so for me, I think I share that with you, and I've written about it a little bit, that we can't separate this. The separation of the spiritual and the intellectual is really like a false binary. Maybe we might say it's a colonial binary or something like this. And oftentimes people who are in the spiritual world get kind of triggered and upset by the intellectual world, and people in the intellectual world get triggered by the spiritual world. And I understand their triggers because I still have both also inside of me. But I think when these worlds understand each other better, that's when things really come together for a more complete picture of experience as we can, as humanly possible.
I like the idea of feeding notions of self. I was alluding to the kosher theory earlier, but however you look at it, there are different human beings are complex and there are various aspects of self which need to be fed. And if you look at every human being, they'll have a predilection or a penchant towards a particular aspect. So almost always musicians are excellent at the feeling world, and maybe they even feel too much or feel too deeply, but that's an asset to appreciation and generation, composition of music or art. And they may or may not have the capacity to understand the sociocultural dimension of why the art is as it is, or et cetera, et cetera. And similarly, those who are just wake up and go to bed reading books about art, they may or may not have the capacity to be moved by the experience Mozart is channeling through the symphony, although they can fully understand the structure of the symphony. And I think there are different aspects of self. There is a Renaissance painting that has just etched in my mind from the moment that I discovered it. I didn't even know what it was, but I saw it and it was like, boom, it was just so powerful. It was Raphael's School of Athens. Now, in ensuing years, it has much more meaning to me because I understand that really it's a depiction of the genesis of humanities in Western civilization. It features a great many figures from antiquity, as imagined by Raphael, 2,000 years later, which is 500 years ago, and he interlaces people of his time on top of his depictions of antiquity, and it's just this profound work. But the center of Raphael is two figures: a little guy named Plato, another little guy named Aristotle, his student, and Plato is pointing up, and Aristotle is pointing down. And this is this brilliant synergy of the archetypal and the practical, right? But even Aristotle, who is one of the greatest and earliest bots of Western civilization, whose concern was classification, right? Intellectualization. But he didn't do it in a vacuum. He was able to execute his intellectual enterprise well aware of Platonic reality and Platonic truths, or however you want to call it, whether from his teacher specifically or sort of culture or even his own inner intuitions. He understood that this intellectualization is happening against the backdrop of something greater that is called the human experience, that is really beyond what we can codify and classify. And I think that religious studies properly done is encapsulated in the dual nature of Raphael's school of Athens, and I think that that is the genesis of the humanities in the West. And I think that we've gone so much towards Aristotle at the expense of Plato that now we have to say, look, by the way, let's get back in the body, embodied learning. The only reason we have the term embodied learning is because of now centuries of disembodied learning. Whereas in Indic traditions, there is no learning that is an embodied learning in terms of spiritual traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recently saw an image of that painting, and I don't remember where online, but I remember thinking this very similar thought of like it's these two worlds wedded together that paint a more complete picture perhaps of the human experience, or give more human experience. I mean, to be able to live in the world of Aristotle and live in the world of Plato, and toggle between the forms and what's actually here, and all of these things really yeah, it provides a kind of profound approach to, and some people will side or err towards one or the other, and that's fine. And but I really do think that this idea that these binaries of head and heart, intellectual and spiritual, and they don't have to be a binary. They can come together, and they can work well together. And that's really how and I know you do as well, approach the study of religion. I mean, there is a lot to learn intellectually, but there's a lot to experience through one's own practice and life experience as well. And even the study itself can be transformative, as we know.
And without question, and that term of life experience, I mean, it's not that we cannot take the human experience out of the humanities. Human experience is the essence of the humanities, and science is, of course, the proper arbiter or methodology to understand the outer world. But the human experience is not. The human experience is our experience of the world, inner and outer. It's not necessarily in the outer world, So it's something that folks really, I think, have a bit of trouble grappling with. So I got a WhatsApp message the other day from a student who cheekily asked. She was part of a group. One of the retreats I did a retreat in June, and then for whatever reason, folks tend to really click at the retreats, but they stayed in contact on this WhatsApp group, and she cheekily asked, "So how would you define wisdom?" I happened to have been doing my morning walk at the time. I have a little game I play with myself where I go and mobile order a coffee and pick it up because it gives me an excuse to go and walk 2 to 3 times a day, because the harder I work, the more I sit. So I'm an educator. And I'm like, I'm just, kind of in this creative mode, and I just bang off this month. Wisdom is the navigation of the material world, cognizant of the spiritual world. That's all I said. And so in many ways, I think wisdom is, how do we navigate this realm in a practical way, but mindful of truths and experiences that's beyond. And so you said something very interesting at the outset, that you're looking for peace of mind, and these Dharma traditions, as you call them, or these traditions of Indic origin, kind of say, well, look, your SOL, their peace of mind. What peace of mind? And they sort of they prescribe remedies for the problem that they describe. Would you say a bit more about that, and maybe specifically with respect to your interest in the features of Jainism?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this ties back to the question of wisdom. And I think it's a good question that your student asked, and the way you answered it was really succinct with regard to the way these traditions would approach it. Dharma traditions, South Asian traditions more broadly. So when we talk about wisdom and in the Jain tradition specifically, we're talking about forms of knowledge, probably better called, but we could call them wisdom as well, that lead one not only to a profound understanding of the world around them, because in the Jain tradition, the world is real. We're not trying to disregard the world in any way, shape, or form. In fact, we're trying to know the world the best way that we can through our 5 senses. And so in Jain knowledge systems, generally speaking, one comes to know the world in a very profound way. And why do they come to know the world in that profound way? Because they don't want to cause any harm to it, because they realize that the nature of the world is suffering. The Jain philosophy says that the nature of the world would be suffering. Everything suffers, and therefore we should try our best to alleviate as much of that suffering as possible, which is really hard to do. It's a high calling, but the only way to be able to do that is to know how suffering is being caused, right? And how do we know how suffering is being caused? Well, there's a lot of ways, but we need to observe the world around us carefully and then act according to that knowledge. And when we act according to that knowledge, we're able to then, I won't get into Jain karma theory, but we're able to burn our karma away. And it's because of our karma that we continue to be reborn and suffer, according to Jain philosophy. And once we're able to burn all that karma away, or as more and more of that karma sheds away, we get closer and closer to liberating our soul, our self, our higher self, our jiva, according to the Jain tradition, sometimes referred to as Atman in some Jain texts, our higher self, that is trapped in this world of being born over and over and over again because of all the harm that we've caused in past lives. And so by getting to know the world and know the world, how the world is ordered, what lives, what does not live, what experiences harm, what does not experience harm, what lives, what doesn't, we are able to then more carefully navigate it, therefore not accrue more of this karma that causes us to suffer ourselves. And when we eventually liberate the world from the suffering that we cause to it through this knowledge, through this empirical knowledge, we gain other forms of knowledge, of spiritual knowledge, which you pointed to when you were talking about the text right now. There's a certain spiritual knowledge or wisdom that slowly starts to emerge and appear. And the Jain tradition is trying to get one from that empirical knowledge, which is a valid form of knowledge, all the way to knowledge of their higher self. And it's a high task, but it's a task that it says is possible, and it's one that their knowledge system describes in such a way. And so where does the peace of mind come into all of that? I guess the peace of mind comes into knowing that at some point, everyone around us could potentially be free from suffering at some point, at some future life, not necessarily in this lifetime, but it could happen. And that gives some hope, some peace of mind, according to this tradition. In addition to all the wonderful yoga practices that bring that kind of acute peace of mind, the breathing, I was doing pranayama before I came to the interview with you too. These things are also wonderful and found in other traditions. But that kind of ultimate bliss peace that is promised in the tradition comes as a result of having the correct knowledge.
Mm. Well, I understand both spiritually speaking why you would do pranayama, and also pragmatically speaking, interviews with yours truly are so grueling. I can understand the need to really calm down before entering the conversation. So it's perfectly understandable.
Not because of you, Raj. I tell you, I do
I'm
pranayama
teasing you.
every couple times a day. It just happened to be before the interview.
Even better, even better. No, prana's good. um what do life is so interesting in that, a very compelling view, a very compelling frame for this thing called life is as sort of the greatest experiential academy ever created, laden with lessons at every turn, and whatever moment you're in, whether it's today, whether it's this week, whether it's this season, whether it's this relationship, what is my quote unquote karmic curriculum? I find this to be very intriguing lens in terms of what we are called to learn, or what we're learning. And oftentimes we'll go through a relationship, say it's temporary, and maybe people have different pensions, opposites attract, and you learn what you need to learn as the relationship is ending. So oftentimes we'll think, oh, if only I knew that at the outset, but really it's a little game we play with ourselves because you needed that experience to know what you learned. But nevertheless, let's play this little game and say, is there something you wish that you knew earlier that you now know? Is there knowledge you now possess, whether about anything at all things in Jainism, this thing called life? What do you wish you had sort of that your younger self might have been aware of, or might have been in possession of, knowledge wise?
The first thing that came to mind was Sanskrit, because gosh, I want to go through all the grammar to learn all that. No, but I know what you mean in terms of life lessons, yes, or these kinds of things, right? As I enter middle age, I feel like I had my midlife crisis in my 20s. I'm very happy now.
It's called being a spiritual seeker.
Spiritual seeker, yeah.
I hear
Oops,
you.
we had to do it early, right?
I dropped out of school at that time, actually.
You see, yeah, exactly, right. And I know I've heard that story from you before, and I know that for a lot of people who end up going into religious studies, the 20s are a difficult time, and they represent all kinds of challenges, and it's almost like you're being told, like, have your crisis now and then get on with it, right? And those were very, very difficult times, in my 20s. So difficult that I feel lucky that I even went through and eventually did a PhD, as I know you did as well. That I encountered all the wonderful supportive teachers and mentors that I had all along the way. And what I really wish I could go back and tell, like, my 20-something-year-old self, really, is that, it's going to be hard, but everything's going to be okay. And the suffering is going to be there, but it's not going to stop you from doing what you need to do, which for me at that time was, I knew from very early on, actually since I was 18, I wanted to do a PhD. I didn't know in what. I knew it would have something to do with religion or theology or something like this, but since I was 18, I wanted to do that. And the kind of fear and anxiety of, like, can I do that? Should I do that? Is it practical? All the questions that you ask, those questions to me now, I look back on my younger self and I just want to tell him, like, it's going to be okay. Just go do it and learn Sanskrit now while it's easy, easier, I should say. And that, that kind of advice, I think I wish more young people had, and really the mentors and the mentorship to kind of usher them along through a path like that. And aren't we so lucky when we find people who, teachers usually, who support us and believe we can do it and see it in us. So that's one of the main things I often think of when I think back on my journey, is like, all the peace of mind seeking you were doing, you already have it. Just chill out, and just keep going. And there's going to be suffering, but there's also going to be a lot of great stuff too. So it's life.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that greatly resonates insofar as whether in self or students or clients or colleagues or really any human being, there's an aspect of self that is on the hamster wheel, right? The rat race. This is an aspect of self that at least in a number of Indic traditions is called the manas, and the mind is not seen as the seat of consciousness. The mind is seen. The mind is the ripples on the pond, the storms on the lake. The mind is not the lake itself. And only when the lake is calmed can you behold the coral beneath, whatever analogy you want to use. And so, as we age, as we grow, as we have experiences, there is the burgeoning of this witness self, or this ability to, yes, I call it camera one and camera two when I teach. Camera one is just ensconced in, your experience of reality from an ego point of view, but then camera two has a greater vision, sort of above the clouds. It can see what Raj is up to. It can see whether or not he really needs to be concerned about this, or whether he can just let this go because it'll all come out in the wash. And so I think that higher self, or that witness consciousness, or that aspect of self that is untouched by the mud of life, I think without question that is an evolute, if not the very fruit being sought of seekers and going through experiences and having that capacity to be like, yeah, this is really nerve-wracking, but I'm more than this experience. And I think that's an extremely useful tool, to have that capacity to reflect, maybe self-respect as well, but self-reflect, and that capacity, or that space from which one can witness even oneself. Because if one is able to witness one's own mental machinations, then one isn't operating from ego. One is operating from a grander, probably wiser, more calm space. So thank you for sharing that. In terms of there might be a number of folks out there listening who either are studying religion, or practicing, or interested in spirituality in some way. I mean, I guess it would depend on situation to situation, but I wonder if there are tips or advice that you might be able or willing to share with folks who are looking to deepen their journey with this material.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from my own experience of how I started without overcommitting myself, but still having access to high quality teachings. And it depends. I would say at the beginning, people might be broad, see what you like, dabble in things, especially if you're young, but at any age. I mean, there's so much to do, right? And so I can think of courses they could take with you at the Indian Wisdom School. They could take courses at Arihanta Institute. There's other online platforms providing teachings in these wisdom schools, if you want to call them that, in these Dharma traditions that are wonderful. And when people get a taste of not only the tradition and the philosophy and the history and all these things and the practices, but also the people who are teaching it, and see who they resonate with and see who they really resonate with in terms of learning, I think then they could get a little bit more focused and really start to focus on things. So that's kind of how I started. I mean, I went to Cal State Long Beach as a hobby in religious studies. I had a lot of great teachers just showing me different religious traditions, East, West, everything in between, indigenous. And I was just kind of enjoying it, building community. And as I said, in my own journey, the Dharma traditions seemed to really stick, and then eventually yoga and Jainism. But I think there's so much that people could draw from. And at the outset, I would say, before you overcommit yourself to doing a graduate program or anything like that, or you don't want to leave your career. I wanted to, right? I wanted to leave my career. Not everybody wants to do that. There's so many tools that we have at our hands now to be able to really dive deep into the study of South Asian religions in particular, and Dharma traditions in particular, but also other as well. So I would say start kind of broad, see what resonates most, and be committed to whatever you choose to do. And what often happens is bumps come in the road, life happens, you want to quit, or you want to stop, or you want to switch. But I just wouldn't jump too much, but at the beginning, at least get a sense of what's out there. And I'm only speaking from my own experience. Maybe some people just like to study everything and do everything, or maybe people like to just jump into one track right away. That's fine too. But this, at least, I think, gives students an opportunity to kind of get a sense of what's out there, and then really devote themselves to one particular tradition, and really find a teacher that you resonate with. I think that that's so important, right? Who supports you, whose values you resonate with, whose style personally you click with. I think this is also really important, because I feel very lucky to have had, for example, my PhD advisor, who, by the great grace of the universe, I met when I was at UC Davis. And, if you can find someone like that who can guide you in what you're interested in, and trust them, I think that's one of the biggest gifts life can give us.
That's beautiful. In terms of teachers that you resonate with, you're referring in your case you're referring to the academic context, advisors. Would you say the same for continuing studies or spiritual education? Could you say a bit more about your views on teaching and teachers?
Yeah, I mean, do you mean non-academic teachers or both?
Both, either. Yeah, I think there's more there for
Yeah,
people.
so I think what I was just referring to is mostly academic teachers, if people are interested in studying these traditions academically. But I think also with regard to teachers, I like what you said, and I can add to this of, if there's no joy, there's no ananda, walk the other way. And that, I have other things where I think, like, walk the other way. I mean, and one of them is, one thing to be very careful of, and we've seen emerge in not just in Dharma traditions, but in spiritual traditions all over the world, and this is nothing new, of course, is that it can become abusive, it can become manipulative, you can get into a lot of trouble if you choose a teacher who doesn't have your best interests in mind, or only just has their own interests in mind, even if they kind of cover that up and it's not so apparent at first. But there are red flags you can encounter in terms of people not being as critical as they should be, hearing things about the school that you're involved, especially if it's a really big guru-led movement or something, about fraud, about abuse. And these are red flags, and it's really easy to get trapped in these things, especially when you're young and you're just starting out on a spiritual path, especially when you're having a crisis. It's important to know that it's also okay to just find psychological help, and at the same time find your path at the same time. I really think that one of the things I wish I had done when I was so early on is just I wish someone had told me that, right? So that I would have probably walked away from other schools earlier than I did, or not believed what the yoga teacher said so early on when I was working at the yoga studio, or things like this, right? Because a lot of the stuff isn't true, or it's clearly meant to manipulate. And so I don't know, I think people should be really careful about that, and really know that you have a strong intellectual capacity of your own. It doesn't mean you have to completely turn yourself over to someone. You might, but there's a certain level of trust, and the way that this person conducts themselves, they should conduct themselves ethically. You should be able to see that over an extended period of time. Everyone's human, so things will happen. But in general, I think that we should tread carefully when entering into spiritual relationship with a teacher.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. So thank you for raising it. There was requests from some students around content around this. So I created a course called what was it called? It was called Guru's Grace, Traditional Teachings Without the Trappings. And it was along the lines of just disambiguating. We have this word teacher in English, or probably an even more problematic term, guru. Problematic not because of its origin or its function, but because of its anglicization and its appropriation for various contexts. Like one could have a business guru, for example. And so when we use the term guru in English, what do we mean? Just like, is my fashion guru, or do we mean like a guru in a traditional sense? And so it's important to disambiguate whether you're coming to someone for knowledge expansion. And there are a great many professors or thought leaders who are fully capable of knowledge expansion. They might lead hideous lives. That doesn't at all take away anything from their ability to expound ideas and master a body of knowledge. That's one piece. You may also be coming to someone for spiritual guidance. That's a different thing altogether, or to mentor you over a period of time. And so one of the sort of binary in my mind that I like to share with people is like, do you feel empowered by this relationship or disempowered by it? Because if someone's after sex or money or power or something egoistic, then you are going to feel disempowered and you are going to feel uncomfortable whether you register it or not. You can submit to a process, as anyone does who takes a course, frankly, but you can even submit in a more deeper way to a process that is ultimately there for your empowerment. Maybe you're being called out on some habits that's detrimental to you or your evolution. That's different from being called out because you didn't do what was beneficial or pleasing to the person in charge. And so check in with yourself. And I can't tell you, there's probably close to a dozen, if you can believe it, of my one-on-one clients, for lack of a better word. I do spiritual guidance work, spiritual coaching work. I think I call it life guidance. So I have no idea what to call it, but one-on-one work. We tell people on their stuff. And I'd say close to a dozen such people have come out of paths that were not what they claimed to be. And they were abused in different ways. And they some of them were in outright cults. And the more difficult cases were where there were elements of the path that were bona fidely culty. I don't mean in a religious studies technical sense cult. I mean in the common parlance culty sense. And overlaid with that were a great many actual bona fide spiritual practices and teachings. And so to separate the wheat from the chaff in those situations can be next to impossible. And so do not critical thinking is an excellent tool, and be sure to apply it in order to vet a path or a person with whom you'd like to study. Now, that doesn't mean, okay, I'm going to fancy myself, smart, and I'm just a diehard contrarian who just wants to blow up every relationship and thing they come across. That's called trolling, not critical thinking. But also, no bona fide spiritual teacher is going to ask you to submit categorically without being vetted. So there's a lot there, and of course, we couldn't begin to address it all on the podcast. But I'm really glad that you brought up this line of thinking and consideration for students. Now, you mentioned pranayama in passing. That sounds lovely. Maybe I'll do some a little later today. If you are comfortable sharing, do you have a spiritual practice? Is it consistent? What are your views on spiritual practice? Is it necessary? Could you say a bit about that?
Yeah, and again, in this podcast, I'm speaking with my practitioner hat on mostly, right? And I'm happy to do that, and I thank you for the opportunity, Raj, because in our field, as we know, we don't do it so often. And I do share it in class, for example, when I'm teaching in the graduate program. My students know, they hear it, we practice together. So in fact, in my Jain yoga seminar that I'm teaching right now, the online graduate seminar, I'm teaching various pranayamas and meditation techniques and things like this, right? And I can say that those techniques are drawn from techniques that I've sort of developed over the years, maybe the past 15 years or so, and which have changed. I mean, there are certain kind of core things that I've always done every day, pranayama being one of the primary things. If you want to say, if I had a consistent practice, I would say pranayama has probably been the most consistent practice. And I do practice, at the moment, I'm practicing a couple times a day, and I really get myself to do that. I also have a kind of devotional side to me that I don't really, it's very private, let's say, right? But of course, I could go to a temple and I could involve myself in performing some kind of devotional exercise, puja or something in a Jain temple, or even in a Hindu temple. But at home, I have my own kind of devotional practice that involves all the things that, being trained in the Yoga Sutra and the notion of Ishvara Pranidhana involves the kind of devotion towards what I feel to be in my heart worthy of devotion, right? So images, for example, of the Tirthankara, the Jinna from the Jain tradition, which for those who haven't studied Jainism, looks kind of like a sitting Buddha, right? So you can imagine what that might look like. These kinds of things. So I do have a very kind of devotional mantra chanting practice that I do every day, pranayama that I do. And then, when I can, depending on where my life's at and stress and all that, I love to, of course, fit in asana. Who doesn't like asana? Who's come up in the yoga world? So sometimes asana, other times I'm exercising, but I don't see those. I see those as spiritual in the sense, in some ways, but they're only kind of like, as people like to say, it's kind of like the warm up for what I'm going to do later, so to speak, right? So I think like my physical health, my emotional, mental, spiritual health all go together. You talked about all the sheaths, right? And somehow every day I try to piece these parts of practice together so that I feel whole, and that I feel kind of reminded, and I've been able to give a little piece of myself through devotion, at least every day. I mean, some days it might last, 20 minutes to an hour. Some days it might be 10 minutes, but it's been consistent. And I think that that's an important thing, right? The consistency for me has been kind of a core thing. And of course, just the way I try to live my life in accordance with the principles of the tradition that I'm engaged in. So I see outside of formal sadhana or kind of spiritual practice, I see my life as like a constant engagement with the world that must be in alignment with what I'm learning and what I'm teaching in these traditions.
That's beautiful. It's beautiful for a number of reasons. One, you know, uh, it's much more than a concept, this idea of embodiment, that when someone is speaking from embodied experience, the world holds much more power than when someone is speaking from an intellectualized idea. It doesn't mean that intellectualism isn't powerful. Of course it is. But think about the idea on a much more mundane level of support groups. We go to support groups. We have a gambling addiction. What do? We go when we hear the story of someone who has the inoculation, the embodied experience of the journey away from that, at least for them. And there's extraordinary power when we hear someone tell us a story that they've lived, right? And so we see this time and time again, the power of embodied experience. And so when we're practicing as what we're preaching as, as teachers, as religious studies teachers, or certainly wisdom teachers in some sense, it's very impactful, right? And also, the world is full of mundane vasanas. The world will give you all kinds of mundane vasanas. And if you want something beyond the mundane, then it makes sense that you'd have to carve out the time and space to develop spiritual vasanas. How can someone be an athlete without exercise? How can someone be a musician without daily practice? How can someone be a bona fide spiritualist or spiritual practitioner or a spiritual seeker or a spiritual finder, if you want to think of it, without exerting, flexing that muscle? And just like comparable to fitness training, yes, you're going to feel certain effects when you're doing when you're running or when you're doing bench press, and certain effects will be during that process. But then once you give yourself to that day, like daily, what happens? Your resting heart rate changes, your resting metabolism changes, your resting muscle mass changes. it transforms your physiology. And the same is true for daily spiritual practice. And I love what you said about the devotional piece, because anyone who has has a heart has the capacity for devotion, and we all are devoted to something. The question is to what? Beyond the physical anatomical heart, you need stents, get stents. Go to a cardiologist. Beyond the emotional heart, the heart of the Manomaya kosha, which might be the heart experiencing anxiety or heartbreak, or look, another piece of chocolate, sure, why not? Beyond that, there is a spiritual heart. And the spiritual heart is very much the aperture to the transpersonal. And knowing and feeling something in your heart is something that you can't only unless someone has had that experience. When even in English we have this really powerful expression, I know in my heart. Well, what do they mean? In the emotional heart? No, the emotional heart will mislead you. It's a spiritual heart wherein one can access experience and possess knowledge. So I really like that, the thread of your share that had to do with devotionalism. Thank you very much for sharing on your daily practice. We could take this podcast in a number of directions, but we will soon wrap up because of our listeners' busy lives and also your busy life. Me, I'm a man of leisure, sort of pseudo retired, but
Retired, retired, but still interviewing so many people about so many great things. Yeah.
This is my retirement plan.
You're doing it right, Raj.
Thanks. There's so many threads. I mean, you and I could literally talk for 3 hours. I mean, are there other threads about the Arihanta Institute, about Jainism, about your journey, about wisdom in general that you think you might like to touch on? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, maybe where it's all kind of brought me now is to the Arihanta Institute, because 3 years ago I was invited. I always have to think back, how many years ago was it? I was invited by the Jain community to change my middle name to Jain. So I wasn't born Christopher Jain Miller. It was a name I took on as sort of feeling like I had finally wrapped myself around and been wrapped by the identity of the Jain tradition that I had been so deeply engaged with, both anthropologically with the community as well as philosophically and teaching and all of these things. And in 2021, I was invited to change my middle name to Jain. So I did that, and I do it for all the publishing purposes. So if you read my most recent work, it will have Jain as the middle name. And I really saw that moment as a kind of culmination of the whole journey I've shared with you today, and also a kind of further commitment to it. And at that same time, we had just started to conceptualize Arihanta Institute as this online learning space to learn about the Jain tradition in particular. And if anybody is interested in studying with me, if anybody's interested in just taking a one-off course, as I mentioned before, you can reach out to me. We also have some scholarships if people are unable. Sometimes people really want to take a course, but they're in hard times. You can reach out to me. We're a nonprofit. And I just really, now being in this space at Arihanta Institute, really enjoy, I think, something similar that you like to do, Raj, which is, I feel like now I'm in a kind of giving and mentoring role for younger people who are clearly on this path. And there are so many people who come to the study of religion because they are thirsty for many of the things I talked about, many of the things you talked about. And I'm very happy to, I'm not a guru, I'm not even a guide, I'm just a professor, but I'm happy to have those students in my class, or even just to meet those students and those people who are on that journey towards finding what's right for them, and what will work for them, and what makes them happy, what brings them bliss, what brings them ultimately, as I wanted so many years ago, peace of mind. So I always enjoy the opportunity to share, and I'm deeply grateful to you, Raj, once again for inviting me to be able to do that.
Oh, it's always a pleasure speaking with you, and I can only imagine that our listeners have found this conversation very insightful, or at very least enjoyable. I would say that, yeah, you are indeed a professor. I'd also say that, to my mind, you're a professor plus, because one could be an excellent professor without engaging in the inner life. But you're a professor insofar as you were able to acquire and disseminate knowledge about a topic and answer questions and troubleshoot and grade and all of that just fine. But the professor plus piece are professors like would be professors such as myself and certainly yourself, who are not just theoreticians or historians, but those who have a sense of rhythm and pitch and musicality, folks who are engaged in the spiritual enterprise, folks who are engaged in meaning. And when I teach credit courses, I teach them teach them the way that you should teach them from an edic perspective. And yet, the spidey sense of the odd student will kind of go off, and they'll broach me and say, Dr. Raj, I this and this and this. And I typically say, well, wait till all the grades are in, and then we'll talk if you'd like to talk about what's going on with you spiritually or personally. No problem, no charge. Obviously, they're undergrads. But it's that plus piece because it's not the dharma proper of the professor of religious studies to spiritually nourish their students. But where we have made a glaring misstep is it certainly is the dharma to not poison their spiritual nourishment. And we have overlooked that as a field. And there's a reason why religious studies is on the chopping block, because we've taken up the work of history and anthropology and sociology and psychology and you name it. What is that unique thing that we're talking about? The unique thing that we're talking about has to do with the inner life and people's spiritual evolution, and whether or not we might be tone deaf. For as long as we deny the existence of music, then for what do we need a musicology department? And so thank you for being a professor plus, and thank you for appearing on the Indian Wisdom podcast.
Well, thank you once again, Raj, for the opportunity. I always enjoy it.